Welcome to RCast, the official podcast of the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. We cover a range of topics on this podcast, from the foundations of blockchain in general to the specifics of RChain, including our foundational language, Golang, as well as issues in calculus, governance, security, and the forthcoming businesses and dApp development on our platform. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about our platform, as well as information on becoming a co-op member.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit today and talk about some of the higher level stuff that RChain is also focused on. One of the ways I think about it is it's one thing to have the bits and bytes, the blockchain platform. There's another kind of technology, which is what I call social technology. And I want to distinguish this from social media, like Instagram or Facebook or whatever. The kind of social technology I'm talking about is more like Robert's Rules of Order, which are, a set of agreements that people use to run meetings in Congress, as an example. So these kinds of social technologies are part and parcel of how we coordinate and how we cooperate. And I think that we don't explore them enough. There's a lot more to be explored in terms of how we coordinate. And I want to talk about using games as an approach to expanding our cooperation and coordination repertoire. So I'm going to talk about 4 games that have different aspects to them that unlock different aspects of this coordination intelligence or collective wisdom. Before I get into it, I just want to check in. Christian, does that make sense?
Yeah, I remember us talking about this in the past, and it's a really interesting and fun topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I keep touching base on this every year or so to help keep it in the discourse. So one of the questions is, why games as opposed to other forms of discourse? And I just want to point out that humans learn through play. If you think about it in terms of sports, games represent a transition from violence to competition to cooperation, right? So the Olympics is an example of a major transformation of human society.
Yeah.
But it's also fairly universal. I mean, it's not just limited to Homo sapiens. Gregory Bates has famously said he was watching some chimpanzees at play. He pointed out that the nip denotes the bite, but does not denote what the bite denotes. So chimpanzees and many other animals play. As people know, I picked up a puppy these last few months, and she is all about play. She just loves to play.
Yeah.
It's cross-species. It's a really important mode of interaction. And one of the reasons it's such an important mode of interaction is it changes our relationship to risk. We are able to tap into more of our capacity when we're able to relax. And it's hard to relax if you feel like everything is at stake. Games sort of take away some of what's at stake so that we can be more exploratory.
Yeah.
But also, if you think about it, what we're looking for is a dialogue between the collective and the individual, and between collectives. And voting is kind of the analog of speaking binary. And what we really need is a higher bandwidth of communication between the individual and the collective. If you were thinking about it in terms of programming languages, you want to climb from binary to assembly to something much higher level like Scala or Golang. And the hypothesis is that games represent our best candidate for a language between the collective and the individual, or a framework for constructing such languages. That's my working hypothesis. Let me talk about some examples of games and their properties that sort of evince these other modes of coordination and cooperation. One kind of game, which I call Pixelian, has very, very simple local actions that is coupled to a global perspective or a global view of the entire game. the entire community that's playing. I've got some slides that will be available, and it's easier to see with the slides. But the idea is that you have a grid. It could be a square grid or a rectangular grid or a triangular grid. Each player has control over exactly one position in this grid. And they can do one of two actions. They can color the location in the grid, which I'll call a pixel. So they can color their pixel from, a palette of colors. Everybody has exactly the same palette. And they can message the other players behind the pixels. So they can interact with the pixels to say, this particular pixel or this group of pixels, I want to send them a message. And that's it. That's all they can do. And so the question is whether or not they'll self-organize, even with those very, very limited set of operations, to create an image that is recognizable or somehow has some aesthetic properties. And I can give a little bit of an anecdote about this. I explained this idea to a developer who got really excited about this in 2008. He made an implementation with a single web page that represented the grid, and then using Twitter as the messaging capability. So you put hashtags in for the commands, which the application would then pick up and use to influence the grid on the single web page. The developer was Hispanic, and so a lot of his community, his friends and fellow developers were also Hispanic. I mentioned that as background because within about 3 hours, they had drawn the Mexican flag, which is very, very impressive, given that the only thing a single player could do is to change one pixel. To me, that's a very, very strong indication. Something like this that has potential to unlock some coordination capacity. But we can go even further. So, I think people have heard me say that. If you have larger numbers of players, and in fact, the larger the number of players you can have, the more detailed or intricate the images you can create. So in some sense, the complexity of the image represents a measure of cooperation. This observation leads to a natural introduction of a place to add contest and monetization. So in general, I want to point out that wherever you introduce a cost, you've introduced friction. People are likely to slow down their action and activity if they think there's a cost associated with it. Right, so you're reintroducing risk when you introduce cost, because now people have to shell something out. Before they were just playing, and now they have to pay to play, and that's a different kind of experience.
Yeah.
But if you follow where there is the possibility of contest, that's a place where you can add cost because people are willing to take more risk when they're in contest with either the game itself, the machine, another player, or another group of players. What you can do is you can have the community against the house, where the house is now just the game itself. And the community puts up a stake, so everyone puts up a certain amount of token or whatever you want to call it. And they are challenged to render an image from a house gallery of images. The house gets to choose the image and chooses after the stake has been put forward. And there's a payout based on the number of moves needed to render the image. And it's computed in terms of the stake divided by the number of moves. If it's a ratio of 1, there's no payout, or anything below 1, there's no payout. If there's a ratio above 1, then the payout is computed as a percentage, some normalized percentage of the ratio above 1. So now there's an incentive to coordinate effectively and efficiently, and they can't devise a strategy based upon the image up front. So they have to figure it out in real time, and they have to figure out how to be efficient in real time.
Just to clarify, so you're saying the house is going to choose the image that ultimately the player should generate. I mean, they'll also be provided with whatever, colors or images that they'll use to create this kind of global image.
Yeah, I think you missed the beginning. So the setup is the players have a grid, and they can only affect one pixel.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're made sure that the palette contains all the colors that they need to do the image.
Mm-hmm. My ultimate question is really, so when you say action now, you're just talking about the changing of a pixel, or is sending a message also considered an action?
Sending a message is also considered an action.
Okay. So they got to do it in kind of the least amount of communication and changes of pixels. Okay.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's correct. And of course, you can now come up with variation on this, right? So you don't have to have community against house. You can have community against community. So two communities can put up stake. The first one to render a chosen image takes the whole pot. Alternatively, the communities can give each other an image to render, right? So they don't have to render the same image. And there's just a number of variations along these lines that I think are worthwhile exploring. The main point now is, one, the first principle is small, simple, local action coupled to a global view. And that view is somehow linked to a notion of aesthetic or beauty or, something that is pleasing. So there's a payoff just in the rendering of the image itself. And then you can introduce a notion of a measure of coordination and cooperation based upon the complexity of the thing that they're rendering. And that is the place to introduce contest. Now what we're trying to do is minimize the amount of effort against the complexity. And that's where we introduce contest. And again, the principle is you introduce monetization at these places where there's an opportunity to excel at something. Because otherwise, when you monetize, it ends up adding friction.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense because that's incentive to come up with some kind of good strategy, right?
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly right. So you're rewarding a good strategy. You're rewarding a certain kind of minimizing or optimization behavior. Now, there's a variation of Pixelian. Sometimes I call it notary. There are other names that might be useful. So now you think of the grid as actually a grid of beats and pitches. So each column is a beat, and then each row represents a pitch class. Again, the players only have a single location on the grid, but the control is now to change the pitch. They can put it as a pitch or they can put it as a rest. Because multiple players can play on the same column, you can get chords. And so essentially now the global view is an auditory view, right? So instead of something aesthetic with your eyes, you can have aesthetics with your ears. And again, the notion of contest can really be in terms of who writes a piece that is most listened to by their audience, right? So that's another notion of contest. And again, this is just a variation on the same idea. We're using the principles to characterize these games and to search for these different kinds of games. But in terms of the measure of what is satisfying, what wins, the winning beat, so to speak, that's done in terms of an aesthetic judgment that can be objective in the sense that it's an aesthetic judgment rendered by some audience. That then connects to a third kind of game, which is putatively individualistic, but has an evolutionary component which connects it to the community. Before I jump into that, let me just check in and see if there are any other thoughts on the last two games.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's a really simple idea, but once you start thinking about it actually being implemented, or people doing different contests and trying to communicate among like hundreds or thousands of people, it quickly gets really interesting, and it's just a different kind of coordination that you never see in everyday life.
That's exactly right. The background is that, I've had a lifelong interest in West African drumming. And in 1998, I wanted to come up with a visual analog of my understanding of of some of what goes on in West African drumming at the whole systems level. One of the most interesting things about West African drumming is that any one line can be played by virtually anyone. So the village idiot like myself can play any one of the particular lines, but it's in the combination of the lines that you get the interest and complexity of the piece. And so I wanted to design something where you had this super, super simple action, but it was in the combination of the actions the complexity of the experience arose and the interest and engagement in the experience arose. Again, it's that kind of principle that's in operation, at least in those kinds of game designs. And I'm just talking about two. I believe that there's an infinite variety of these games, and once people get the knack for thinking about it, they'll probably come up with much better versions than I did put forward. On to this other one. I call this skein. It's really designed for a virtual musical instrument, but there's a gaming aspect to it. The first thing that we notice is that in order to make a note, you have to have both a pitch and a rhythm. So you can kind of split a note into two pieces of information. And this is what happens in Western classical notation. You've got information about the pitch and you've got information about duration. And there's lots of other information that goes into, real musical production of notes. But, at a coarse grain level, that's something that goes on. And once you see that you can split notes into these two kinds of data, you could imagine having a stream of pitches and a stream of durations, right? So I've got this infinite list of pitches and an infinite list of durations. I could zipper them together. And as long as they were infinite, I could have some basic operations on these infinite streams. So one is I could zipper two streams together, and so now I'm getting pairs. The paired information is enough to produce a stream of notes, an infinite melody. But because they're infinite, I could advance one of the streams. So, if we think of these as two infinite ribbons, I could yank on one of the ribbons and then start zippering them at that point. One would be offset with respect to the other, and so I get a different stream of notes. So I could yank either one independently. I could start zippering, I could stop the zippering, and then yank on one or yank on the other. That will give me different streams of notes. The other thing I can do is I could twist. So I can take things that were duration information. If I had a transformation from duration to pitch and pitch to duration, I can now twist these two ribbons, right? So there's a nice physical geometric analog to all of these operations, which gives us an ability to render this as a human-computer interface using the infrared sensor, the leap motion infrared sensor, which can sense your hand. So you can have gestures for yanking and gestures for twisting and gestures for zippering. And then there's another gesture that you can have, which is snipping. So let's say that there's some finite portion of this infinite stream that catches your ear, that you like it. So you stop the play and you snip both ends, and then that snip can go up into a repository of snips. And this is where the community gets engaged, which is that you have this, since the snippets of music, these little melody strands can be split, you allow them to be heard by a community, by an audience. And those strands that get a lot of replays are considered successful. You can take strands that have the same length and they can create progeny, because you can unzip them. So let's say I have strand 1 and strand 2. Then the pitch part of strand 1 can go with the duration part of strand 2.
Yeah.
And the duration part of strand 1 can go with the pitch part of strand 2.
That's cool. I was wondering why you were making it look like DNA. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
I have what I think might be a good addition to this. It would be really cool to, as the stream of notes and beats are kind of going by and you catch something that you like, you can maybe capture that and put it in a loop or something and have it play a couple times and then go into something else, kind of like what a DJ does basically.
Absolutely. No, I love it. That's a great addition. Yeah, you could do this higher order in that way, and I think that's a really good addition. You can do that same kind of higher order iteration thing with the images. So you can use the images to make mosaics over in the Pixelian thing. But yes, you're absolutely right. Now, one final point on this one, the pitch generation, the stream generation can come from transcendental numbers. So for example, you can use the spigot algorithm, which generates one digit at a time, to generate an expansion of pi or an expansion of e, or other transcendental numbers. The interesting point is like, what would be the natural base for that expansion? And this is where knowing something a little bit about the domain helps. So, for example, most pop songs end up more or less within a range of 3 octaves. You can rewrite pi in base 22. So that's 3 diatonic octaves, that 7 notes per octave. That's 21 plus 1 for a rest. Now you might want to consider frequency and distribution, so you have a rest per octave. So that would be base 24. But basically, the idea is when you put it in that base, you get a much better likelihood that it sounds like music as opposed to sounding like noise. And with respect to durations, you can use a lot of Western music. In fact, a lot of world music is in some kind of dyadic time signature. So as a first approximation, rhythmic complexity is really an important part of music. But as a first approximation to something interesting, you can just consider whole note, half note, quarter note, eighth note, and 16th note. And so you're considering an expansion of your transcendental number in base 5. That will give you a pitch source and a duration source that is likely to yield something that is musical. If you use, instead of the diatonic scale, the pentatonic scale, it's almost certainly going to be consonant and pleasing to the ear. The other thing that's really interesting to me about this is that all of this happened before the dawn of time. So if we use the transcendental numbers, pi and e were there before there were humans.
And we'll be here after.
and we'll be here after. So all of this music that the musician is exploring is already all being played all at once. But it's really the musician's choice to explore the music that is bringing it into the auditory realm for humans. It's different than the experience of playing a guitar or a piano or a Kellstone, because here we're sort of plucking it from the infinite realm, from the mathematical realm, where as opposed to the other way around. Part of the reason I designed this game was to help people understand that sometimes the experience of music is just like that. The music was already there, and we're the conduit for the music to get heard.
I just wanted to say 2 things. I thought of another thing that could be really cool and make it more music-like, I guess. Having some sort of adjustment for the beats per minute or something along those lines, yes. So you can adjust for the speed as well instead of just having the different durations for the notes, I guess.
Yep, tempo modulation is a great idea. Absolutely.
Yeah. And the other thing is, and I know I mentioned this on Monday when you were talking about this stuff, is that I find it so interesting that the leap motion device comes up in these discussions, because like I said, the CTO of that company is like a good friend of mine from undergrad. Actually, and after I realized that on Monday, I started thinking about it, and I can remember like specific conversations that we had, trying to like take breaks from studying and stuff. And, I would like juggle to, that was kind of like my thing I did to pass the time. Mm-hmm. And he was like describing to me like how these different shadow motions can work, and, how you can kind of like track things in space, like using this sort of like infrared stuff. And so I remember a specific conversation where I'm like juggling, and he's trying to explain this idea to me.
That's really cool, Isaac. That's pretty awesome. Well, maybe if you can get us in touch, maybe we should have a chat.
Yeah, I don't see why that would be an issue. I can reach out to him, definitely.
That'd be awesome. That'd be really fun. Oh, well, one of the things I should point out is that all of these have very natural representations in Rolang. Streams of pitch information and processing over streams has a very, very natural representation in Rolang. Likewise, the representation of the grid and content. Anything that has to do with a notion of location maps very nicely onto a notion of name. Mm-hmm. These things map onto our the RChain blockchain fairly straightforwardly. Part of the reason I'm saying that is, if there are any developers out there who find these ideas intriguing, my guess is that it's probably a fairly quick implementation to get to a prototype of any one of these. I'm throwing some stuff out there to see if anyone takes the bait.
Sorry, why is it called skein?
Because you're literally weaving strands.
Oh, yes.
The last one, I intended it as a kind of commentary. Like it's no secret that the U.S. is unfortunately racially divided, and that people of color are facing a very different experience in the U.S. than Caucasian folks. And so I wanted to kind of invert that idea. So I came up with this idea called Ink Me. And the idea is to find out what color person you are. But I'm expanding the palette of colors considerably. One of the things I'm trying to explore in this is ambiguity in terms of the semantic gestures is really an important part of the gamification process and in terms of engagement. People have an innate desire to make meaning out of gestures. And they want to be creative. People like coining new words. Some languages are actually quite good at this. As I understand it, Hebrew is built off of these trigrams. And if you get the knack of how to combine the trigrams, you can easily construct new words. And that this is something that every 8-year-old, and again, this is just what I've been told from Hebrew scholars. So I've never verified it for myself because I don't speak Hebrew. But what I've been told is that a competent speaker can mint new words, and everyone will understand what they mean. So one data point in lots and lots where the idea is that people like to be creative with language. Like, for example, I think while Facebook was brilliant when they added the like button to capture sentiment, when they tried to go a step further with the emotional emojis, I think they missed an opportunity, which was to let people discover the emotional content by having more ambiguous gestures.
Yeah.
This is another part of what Ink Me is all about. People who are come to this through the website can see some fairly detailed specs that I made for the application, and you can see how long ago I made them because the phone interface that I drew them on is several generations old.
Gotta say, I love the characters that you chose. Love the community.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is that you have some community of characters, some cast of characters. I chose the characters from the TV show Community, and essentially what they do is they upload their profile, so they have a profile pic, and they can be connected with other players, other characters in the community. Again, it's very simple. There's only one action. For example, let's say that Abed is one of the characters, and he's connected to Britta. Then what he can do is to select a color that he thinks Britta is, or that somehow represents his engagement or relationship with Britta. Again, it's purposefully ambiguous. We don't know what Abed means specifically by coloring Britta in this way. When Britta goes to check her profile, she notices that Abed has colored her, so she gets a little notification, and she clicks on the notification, and there's a little strand labeled with Abed's name that it runs in such a way that it hits or intersects with her avatar or her profile picture, and she can see this little strand of color. The same thing can happen from other characters. So Annie, for example, might be a friend of Britta in this game, in this community, and she might also color Britta. And so she selects a color, and then Britta gets a notification from Annie. And eventually, what we see is that Britta has some flag of colors that her community has colored her. The thought is, again, simple actions. The community begins to work out for themselves what colors mean, and that meaning may be dynamic. It may shift, it may change over time, in the same way that the meanings of words shift and change. And in some sense, the measure of the coherence of of those meanings is a measure of the coherence of the community. There's a wonderful comment. C.S. Lewis, who was a philologist by training and career. I mean, we know him for his wonderful works of fiction, but he wrote some fairly serious scholarship, and he has a book called Studies in Words, in which he traces the meanings of common words, either from the Latin origins or the Germanic origins throughout their history. And he has this really astonishing comment. He says that most words, like human lives, begin with a fantastic promise and end in noise.
Mm.
For me, it's a very inspiring comment. You know, it makes me want to have my life not quite end in noise. The relevance of that comment here is that, again, if the community is coherent, then the semantic information in the gesture of coloring people will take hold, and people will know what they're saying to each other in this emotional language of color. That's basically the idea. I have not yet thought about how this might be monetized. I don't know how to connect it to that aspect of the blockchain. I know how to implement it in Rolang. I haven't really thought about where one might inject the introduction of contest so that there's the possibility to have a transactional behavior. But I'm open if you guys have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's a good feature as a part of some broader social platform or something.
Yeah, sure. You could do it that way. I'm always interested in games that are as simple as Go. The rules for Go are incredibly simple, right? The fact is that complexity arises out of that simplicity. Embed this in a chat application, and it would be a nice addition. In review, then, simple actions coupled to a global view is an important principle. Another important principle is that the complexity of the global view represents a measure of the coordination. And so that's a place to introduce contest. In general, you want to avoid putting cost to actions that you would actually like to accelerate, right? So anything that is really something that you need to be happening frequently, you don't want to slow it down. And adding cost adds friction. So that will slow things down. You want to put cost where there's a natural notion of contest and sort of climbing a ladder of excellence. Another principle is to add evolutionary capability. RChain introduces genetic algorithms, genetic programming components to the mix. And then finally, you want to leave room for ambiguity. There has to be a place where people can create, they can make the game their own. They can overlay action within the game with their own meaning. Those are the principles that go into these game designs, and they're also principles, I believe, that go into unlocking our notions of cooperation and coordination.
I was wondering if you were going to mention that protein folding game. Did you know about that?
I know a little bit about it. Why don't you tell us?
Some research lab was facing some difficult computational problem with protein folding because it's so intensive, and made an online multiplayer game out of figuring out like how these proteins fit together or something. I'm not sure what they were doing. Isaac, do you know what I'm talking about?
I have never heard of what you're talking about, actually.
Well,
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know the name or how we could find it?
No, I know one of the principals. His name escapes me now.
But yeah, apparently they ended up solving some previously unknown problems.
Well, again, the whole idea of the collective intelligence is quite strong. You know, so that's a great application. I'm looking for principles, like how to unlock the collective intelligence and how to enable the collective intelligence.
You started out mentioning how voting was like a low-level language. How do you incorporate collective decision making into this, like real world decision making as an example of this?
First of all, I believe that decisions happen, they follow processes that are sort of like chemical processes, in the sense that there's a period where it looks like nothing is happening, but actually a lot of information is being gathered. And the way it's being gathered and how it's being stored is often misapprehended or not well perceived. My sense is that decision-making processes happen because there's a collection of sentiment. So before you have an expression of will, you have a collection of sentiment, so people are feeling something, and being able to capture the information about that sentiment, there needs to be some manifestation or representation of the entity about which they are having feelings. Meme construction is a way that people sort of begin to get these clusters of concepts, and then they have an expression of sentiment about those clusters of concepts. Does that make sense? I'm expressing it fairly abstractly, but on purpose. I'm trying to get to the principles. There's a period of formation of meme-like gadgets, and then there's a period of how the collective feels about those meme-like gadgets, and then there's it's almost like a super saturated solution. Then boom, there's an expression of will. This is the community's response, this idea or this proposal or something like that.
It would be good to brainstorm something like that.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Is that game called Folded by any chance?
Yeah.
University of Washington.
Yeah, I want to try it.
Yeah, it looks pretty cool. Apparently has 240,000 registered players.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.